Elias strangled his own benefactor to steal this plantation and burned the papers that promised Martha her freedom. He believes the only witness to his crime is rotting under the floorboards of the stable. He is dead wrong. Martha saw everything from the kitchen window, and today his morning soup contains the bitter extract of the oleander. The poison is already moving through his veins, and the evidence of his murder is about to be pulled from the dirt. By the time the noon bell rings, the master will realize that the woman he treats like property is the one who will send him to the gallows. The air in the South Carolina low country is thick. It's the kind of heat that sticks to your skin before the sun is even fully over the horizon. At the Blackwood estate, the morning starts with the sound of the iron bell. But for Martha, it starts long before that. She is 50 years old, and her bones ache with the dampness of the river. But her hands are steady. They have to be. She is the head cook, a woman who has learned that the best way to survive is to be invisible. She sees everything, hears everything, and says absolutely nothing. Elias Blackwood thinks he's the king of these acres. He walks with a heavy boot and a heavier hand. He took this land by force and by blood, stepping over the cooling body of his own uncle to claim a title that was never meant for him. He thinks he's safe because he burned the will. He thinks he's secure because he's the one holding the whip. But he forgot one thing. He forgot that the woman who feeds him every morning is the same woman who loved the man he murdered. 6 months ago, the Blackwood estate was a different place. The old master, Elias's uncle, was a man of his word. He was frail, yes, but he was fair. He had signed the papers. Martha had seen them. They were thick, official documents with red wax seals that promised her and 3 others their legal manumission. They were supposed to be free the moment the old man drew his last breath. But Elias didn't want to wait for nature to take its course, and he certainly didn't want to lose the most valuable assets on the farm. Martha remembers that night like it happened 10 minutes ago. The moon was a sliver of white over the marsh. She was in the summer kitchen, cleaning the last of the copper pots, when she heard the struggle in the stable. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a dull thud and the sound of a man trying to catch a breath that wouldn't come. She looked through the window, through the gap in the shutters, and she saw Elias. His face was twisted, his eyes bulging with a frantic, greedy energy. He had his hands around his uncle's throat. The old man didn't stand a chance. He was small, and Elias was a man fueled by years of resentment and debt. When it was over, Elias didn't call for a doctor. He didn't scream for help. He stood there, wiping sweat from his forehead, and then he began to dig. He dragged the body into the shadows of the back stall, under the loose floorboards where the earth stayed soft from the humidity. But Elias was shaken. He was moving too fast. As he dragged the body, his hand caught on the rough wood of the stall door. A heavy silver bloodstone ring, the uncle's signature piece, snapped off his finger. It fell into the muck, disappearing into the black dirt and hay. Elias didn't notice. He was too busy burying his crime. The next morning, the story was that the old master had suffered a heart attack in his sleep. Elias produced a will, but it wasn't the one Martha had seen. This one left everything to him and mentioned nothing about freedom for the staff. Martha watched from the doorway as Elias tossed the real papers into the fireplace. She saw the edges curl, the ink turn to ash, and the promise of her life outside these gates vanish in a puff of smoke. Elias looked at her then, his eyes cold and challenging. He told her she would stay in the kitchen. He told her if she ever breathed a word of what she thought she knew, he'd sell her downriver to the sugar mills. And in that moment, Martha realized that the law didn't care about what a slave saw. The law cared about property. So she went back to her stove. She went back to her herbs. But Martha knew things Elias didn't. She knew the woods behind the plantation better than any man. She knew which plants could heal a fever and which ones could stop a heart. She started gathering the oleander leaves, just a few at first. She dried them, ground them into a fine powder, and waited. The first blow of Elias's true nature came a week after the funeral. He stopped the extra rations. He began to rule by the lash, punishing Silas, the young stable hand, for the slightest delay in saddling the horses. Silas was only 20, a boy with a quick smile that Elias seemed determined to break. Elias knew Silas had been close to the old master. He suspected the boy knew something, so he kept him under a constant state of fear. The second blow was the housemaid Sarah. She was young, barely 19, and terrified of Elias's temper. He would throw heavy crystal decanters at her if the tea wasn't hot enough. He wanted everyone to know that the old regime was dead. He wanted them to feel the weight of his new authority. The third blow, the one that set everything in motion, was when Elias announced he was bringing in a federal circuit judge for a week-long visit. Judge Miller, a man of high standing and strict adherence to the letter of the law. Elias wanted the judge to see him as a respected landowner, a pillar of the community. He wanted to solidify his stolen legacy. Silver bloodstone ring. Martha decided that the judge's arrival would be the day. She didn't want Elias just to die. She wanted him to be exposed. She wanted him to feel the walls closing in while he was still alive, to understand who had defeated him. For weeks, she had been adding a tiny, almost undetectable amount of the oleander extract to his morning coffee. It started with a slight tremor in his hands. Then came the shortness of breath. Elias blamed it on the summer heat. He blamed it on the stress of running the estate. He had no idea that his own body was slowly turning against him, one meal at a time. Silas was the key. Martha had whispered to him near the well one evening. She told him where to look in the stable. She told him that the earth under the third stall held the only thing that could prove Elias was a murderer. Silas was terrified. He knew that if he was caught digging, Elias would kill him on the spot. But the memory of the old master and the hope of the freedom that had been stolen gave him a desperate kind of courage. While Martha worked in the kitchen, Silas watched for his moment. He watched Elias's routine. Every morning, Elias would spend an hour in his study, going over the ledgers, trying to hide the debts he was accruing. That was the window. Today, the morning of the judge's arrival, the air feels different. There is a tension in the house that even the walls seem to feel. Martha stands over the large iron pot on the stove. The soup is a rich beef broth, dark and savory, but it has a slight metallic bitterness to it today. She has used a double dose of the extract. Not enough to kill him instantly, but enough to make his heart stutter, enough to make him collapse when the pressure hits. She hears the heavy footsteps of Elias in the hallway. He sounds slower today. His boots don't click with the same sharp authority. He enters the dining room, calling for his breakfast. Sarah is there, her hands shaking as she lays the white linen cloth. Martha can see Sarah's terror from the kitchen doorway. The girl is close to breaking. If she drops a plate, Elias might snap, and the whole plan could go sideways before the judge even pulls up in his carriage. Martha moves into the dining room with the tureen. She moves with a grace that hides the fire in her chest. She places the bowl in front of Elias. He looks up at her, his face pale, a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead. He looks at the soup, then back at Martha. "It smells different today, Martha," he says, his voice raspy. Martha doesn't blink. She doesn't look away. "Just a few extra herbs from the garden, master, to help with that heaviness in your chest you've been complaining about." Elias picks up the silver spoon. His hand is trembling so much the spoon clinks against the side of the ceramic bowl. It's a small sound, but in the silence of the room it sounds like a hammer hitting an anvil. He lifts the first spoonful to his lips. Martha watches. She doesn't breathe. Outside, in the distance, the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel driveway begins to grow louder. Judge Miller is arriving, and at that exact moment, across the yard, in the shadows of the stable, Silas feels his shovel hit something hard, something that isn't a rock, something that doesn't belong in the dirt.
He reaches down into the muck, his fingers cold, and pulls out a heavy silver ring with a blood-red stone. The game has started, and Elias Blackwood has no idea that the soup he just swallowed is the last thing he will ever taste as a free man. He looks at the door, expecting to see his prestigious guest, but all he can see is the room beginning to spin. The bitterness is no longer just in the soup, it's in his throat, in his lungs, and in the very air he's struggling to breathe. Elias pushed the porcelain bowl toward the center of the table, the silver spoon clattering against the wood like a warning shot. He didn't look at the soup, he looked at Martha. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites turned a sickly shade of yellow, and his skin had the gray, waxy look of a man who was already halfway to the graveyard. He felt the heat in his chest, a slow, burning fire that had been smoldering for weeks, but this morning the flame was climbing higher. He suspected everyone. He suspected the air he breathed, the floorboards he walked on, and especially the woman who had prepared his every meal for the last 20 years. "Eat it," Elias said, his voice a low, growly rasp. He didn't ask, it was an order. He watched Martha's face, looking for a flicker of hesitation, a twitch in her eyelid, anything that would confirm the poison he felt sure was dancing in his veins. He knew what he had done to his uncle. He knew that secrets have a way of poisoning the soil they are buried in, and he knew that Martha was the only one who had been close enough to smell the rot. Martha didn't move for a long second. She stood tall, her apron stained with flour and the green residue of the herbs she had been crushing since 4 in the morning. She felt the weight of the oleander extract hidden in her pocket, the small glass vial that was now empty. She knew the concentration. She knew that 1 spoonful wouldn't kill her, but it would make her heart race. It would make her dizzy. But if she refused, the game was over. Elias would have her dragged to the whipping post before the judge's carriage even cleared the tree line. Look at this. A man plants thorns for a lifetime and expects to harvest silk. But the earth never forgets a debt, and the kitchen always knows the truth. Martha reached out, her fingers steady despite the pounding in her ears. She took the spoon. She dipped it into the dark, rich broth, making sure to catch the flecks of green herbs floating on the surface. She lifted it to her mouth and swallowed. The bitterness was immediate, a sharp, metallic tang that coated the back of her throat like copper. She didn't gag, she didn't flinch. She simply lowered the spoon and looked Elias in the eye, her expression as blank as a fresh sheet of parchment. "Is it to your liking, master?" she asked. The word master felt like a stone in her mouth, but she spit it out with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 5 decades surviving. Elias stared at her, his jaw working. He wanted to see her collapse. He wanted to see her scream, but she stood there as solid as the oak trees lining the drive. He grunted, a sound of frustrated paranoia, and pulled the bowl back toward him. He took a large gulp of the soup, the warmth of the broth masking the poison for just a moment. He was hungry, and the oleander was already making his mind foggy, making it harder for him to think clearly. He needed his strength. Judge Miller would be here any minute, and Elias had to be the picture of a successful, healthy heir. But while Elias was eating his own slow death, Silas was in the stable, and the situation there was falling apart. Silas had found the ring. He could feel it in his pocket, a cold, heavy lump of silver that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. But he had been digging too long. The dirt was piled up near the back stall, and he hadn't heard the footsteps approaching. One of the overseers, a man named Miller, no relation to the judge but just as cruel, had walked into the stable to check on the carriage horses. He saw the shovel. He saw the disturbed earth. Silas was standing there, his face covered with sweat and stable muck, his hand clenching the fabric of his trousers where the ring was hidden. "What are you doing back here, boy?" the overseer barked. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of the whip at his belt. He looked at the floorboards, then back at Silas. He knew Silas was the old master's favorite. He knew Elias wanted any excuse to get rid of the boy. Silas couldn't find his voice. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked toward the house, hoping for a sign, a distraction, anything. He knew that if the overseer searched him and found that silver bloodstone ring, it wouldn't matter what the judge said. He'd be dead before he could tell the truth. Back in the dining room, Martha saw the overseer heading toward the stable through the window. She saw the way he was moving fast, purposeful. She knew Silas was in danger.
Trouble. She looked at Elias, who was now leaning back in his chair, his eyes half closed as the first wave of the double dose began to hit him. He was gasping for air, his lungs feeling like they were being squeezed by invisible hands. "The horses," Martha whispered, loud enough for Elias to hear. "I saw the overseer heading to the stable. He looked angry. Master said something about the judge's carriage needing the best team." Elias blinked, trying to clear his vision. The mention of the judge acted like a jolt of electricity. He couldn't have anything go wrong now. He forced himself to stand, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. He stumbled toward the window, his hand gripping the edge of the dining table so hard his knuckles turned white. "What?" Elias barked, his voice cracking. He looked out and saw the overseer confronting Silas. His paranoia flared again. Was Silas trying to run? Was he stealing? Elias didn't think about his own failing heart. He didn't think about the soup. He thought about control. If you don't believe in lies dressed in fine linen and want to see the mask ripped off, subscribe. This ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. Was it a signal for help or a death warrant for everyone in that house? Martha knew she had to act. If Elias went out there now, he'd catch Silas with the ring. She had to create a reason for everyone to stay away from that stable for 5 more minutes. She turned back to the kitchen, her mind racing. She saw the stack of dry dishcloths near the hearth. She saw the oil lamp hanging by the door. It was a risk. If the house burned, she'd be blamed. But if Silas was caught, they were all dead anyway. She grabbed a handful of the dry cloths and tossed them onto the glowing embers of the wood stove. Then, with a deliberate motion, she tipped the oil lamp. The flame caught the oil, and a wall of orange fire erupted in the small kitchen. "Fire!" Martha screamed. "The kitchen is on fire!" The cry echoed through the house. Sarah, the young maid, came running from the hallway, her face pale with terror. Elias, halfway to the door, froze. A fire was the one thing every plantation owner feared more than an uprising. A fire could take the whole crop, the whole house, the whole legacy in an afternoon. Elias turned back, his face contorted in a mask of agony and rage. He tried to shout for the overseer, but his throat felt like it was closing up. The oleander was working. He staggered toward the kitchen, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Outside, the overseer heard the scream. He looked away from Silas for a split second, turning his head toward the smoke beginning to billow from the kitchen window. That second was all Silas needed. He bolted. He didn't run toward the woods. He ran toward the back of the house, toward the small crawl space under the porch where Martha sometimes hid her extra supplies. He slid into the damp, dark space, his chest heaving. He pulled the ring out of his pocket and looked at it. Even in the dim light, the bloodstone glowed like a drop of fresh blood. It was caked in the same mud that had covered the old master's body. It was the smoking gun. But he was trapped. The overseer was shouting. The house was in chaos, and the judge's carriage was finally pulling into the yard. Martha stood in the middle of the smoke, her eyes stinging. She wasn't putting the fire out. She was directing Sarah to throw water on the walls, making it look like they were fighting it, but she was keeping the smoke thick. She needed the judge to see the chaos. She needed Elias to be pushed to the brink of a total collapse. Elias burst into the kitchen, coughing, his eyes streaming. He looked at the flames, then at Martha. He tried to raise his hand to strike her, to blame her for the mess, but his arm wouldn't obey. He slumped against the door frame, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. "The judge," Elias wheezed. "He's here, master," Martha said, her voice calm amidst the roaring of the fire. She stepped toward him, her face inches from his. She could see the pupils of his eyes dilating, a sure sign that the poison was taking hold of his nervous system. The judge is at the front door, and you look like a man who's seen a ghost." Elias tried to speak, but only a thin line of gray foam appeared at the corner of his mouth. He looked terrified. For the first time, the reality of his situation was starting to pierce through his greed. He was losing control of his house, his body, and his secret. The front door of the mansion creaked open. The heavy, measured footsteps of Judge Miller echoed in the grand foyer. The judge was a man who lived by the clock and the code. He stood 6 feet tall, with a face carved out of New England granite. He looked at the chaos, then at the trembling man before him, and his mouth thinned into a line of pure iron. "Elias," the judge said, his voice booming in the high-ceilinged room, "explain the state of your home. Why is there smoke in the hallways? Why are you shivering like a man with the egg in the middle of a South Carolina summer?" Elias tried to answer. He opened his mouth, but his tongue felt like a thick, dry sponge. His heart was doing a frantic dance against his ribs, skipping beats, then racing so fast he felt a sharp stabbing pain behind his left eye. He wanted to point to the kitchen. He wanted to tell the judge that Martha had tried to burn the house down. He wanted to say that the soup tasted like copper and death, but all that came out was a pathetic, wet wheeze. The fire was under control, but the damage was...
To Elias's reputation was just beginning. Martha stood by the blackened stove, her face covered in soot. She looked like a victim, a tired old woman who had barely saved the master's house from a kitchen accident. But inside, her mind was as sharp as a butcher's knife. She saw Miller, the overseer, stepping into the kitchen from the back porch. He was holding a leather whip, and his eyes were searching the room for Silas. "Where is the boy?" Miller barked. He didn't care about the fire. He cared about the fact that Silas had been digging in a place he wasn't supposed to be. "I saw him running. I saw him clenching something in his hand. If you're hiding him, I'll peel the skin off your back myself." Martha didn't flinch. She picked up a heavy iron skillet and moved it to the side of the stove. "The boy is terrified, Miller. Can't you see the house almost went up? He's probably hiding in the stables, crying for the old master. Why are you bothering a boy when the judge is in the foyer and the master is collapsing?" Miller hesitated. He looked toward the dining room door. He could hear the judge's voice, loud, demanding, and full of authority. He knew that if he caused a scene now, it would reflect poorly on him. But he also knew that Elias was paranoid. If Silas had found something and Miller let him get away with it, Elias would have Miller's head. "I'll find him," Miller hissed, "and when I do, he'll wish he'd stayed in that hole he was digging." He turned and marched out, heading toward the stables. Martha watched him go, her heart sinking. Silas wasn't in the stables. He was under the porch, only a few feet away from where the judge was standing. If Silas moved, if he breathed too loud, the overseer would hear him. And if the overseer found him first, that silver bloodstone ring would never see the light of day. It would be buried again, this time with Silas's body. Martha stepped out of the kitchen and into the dining room. She had to bridge the gap. She had to get the judge and Elias into a room where she could control the flow of information. She saw Elias leaning against the sideboard, his head lolling. The judge was standing 2 paces away, his arms crossed, looking at Elias with a mixture of pity and disgust. "The breakfast is served, Your Honor," Martha said, her voice low and steady. She walked to the table and began to clear the half-eaten bowl of soup. She did it quickly, making sure the judge didn't get a close look at the dark, bitter liquid. "Master Elias is just overcome by the heat. It's been a long season. If you're the kind of person who stays until a last stone is turned because you know the truth is always worth the wait, subscribe and tell me in a house full of witnesses who is more dangerous, the man with the whip or the woman with the spoon." The judge looked at Martha, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the soot on her face, but he also saw the intelligence in her eyes. He was a man trained to read people, and something about this cook didn't match the image of a simple servant. She was too calm, too precise. "He looks more than overcome, woman," the judge said, pointing a gloved finger at Elias. "He looks like he's dying." Elias managed to pull himself upright. The fear of the judge was momentarily stronger than the poison. He forced a smile that looked more like a grimace of pain. "I am fine, Miller. A passing spell. Please sit. The estate has much to discuss." Every word was a struggle. His vision was tunneling. The edges of the room would turn in black, and the only thing he could focus on was the white linen of the tablecloth. He sat down heavily, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood. Martha moved back to the kitchen, but she didn't stay there. She went to the back door and whistled a low, sharp note, the sound of a swamp owl. It was a signal they had practiced. A moment later, she saw a shadow move under the porch. Silas crawled out from the latticework, his face streaked with tears and dirt. He was trembling so hard he could barely stand. "Give it to me," Martha whispered, reaching out her hand. Silas hesitated. "The overseer. He's in the stable, Martha. He's looking for me. He'll kill me." "He won't kill you if the judge is holding the proof," Martha said. "Give me the ring, Silas. Now, go to the woods. Don't come back until you hear the noon bell. If the bell rings 3 times, you're free. If it doesn't, keep running." Silas pressed the silver bloodstone ring into Martha's palm. It was cold and caked in black, wet earth. It smelled like the grave. Martha closed her fingers around the setting. This was it. This was the piece of his uncle that Elias couldn't burn. This was the ghost that had come back to claim the house. She tucked the ring into the deep pocket of her apron. She had to wait for the right moment. The judge was a man of evidence. He wouldn't arrest a landowner on the word of a slave. He needed something undeniable. He needed to see the theft. She returned to the dining room with a fresh pot of coffee. The judge was talking about the legal transition of the estate. He was asking Elias about the original will. He was asking why the old master hadn't left anything to the loyal staff who had served him for decades. "It was his wish," Elias lied, his voice barely a whisper. He reached for his water glass, but his hand failed him. The glass tipped, spilling water across the table, soaking the papers the judge had laid out. "Damn it, Elias," the judge snapped, pulling his documents away from the growing puddle. "You are in no fit state. Where are the original manumission records? I want to see the seals. I want to see the signatures." "They burned," Elias gasped. He was clutching his chest now. The double dose of oleander was starting to shut down his heart. "In the kitchen fire, just now, all gone." Martha stood by the sideboard, the silver ring heavy in her pocket. Silas was out of the house. He was safe for the moment. Now it was Martha's turn. She had to bring the ghost inside. She stepped forward, a tiny figure in the shadow of the large dining room. Her voice was low, but it carried across the room. The old master was a fair man. He wouldn't have abandoned those who served him well, especially the young ones. The judge turned toward her, his eyes narrowing, his face a shadow of confusion and curiosity.
The opening. Elias had just lied to a federal judge. He had just claimed the records were destroyed in a fire that Martha had started. He was digging his own hole, just like he had dug the hole in the stable. "Not everything burned, Master Elias," Martha said, her voice cutting through the tension like a cold wind. The judge looked up. Elias froze, his eyes wide with a sudden paralyzing fear. He looked at Martha, and for the first time, he saw the death sentence written on her face. He realized she wasn't just the cook, she was the executioner. "What did you say?" the judge asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I saved something from the fire," Martha said, stepping toward the table. "Something the master must have dropped when he was busy in the stable the night the old master passed." She reached into her pocket. She could feel Elias's eyes on her, frantic, pleading, murderous.
He tried to lunge at her, to grab her throat, to stop the words before they could leave her mouth, but the poison was too fast. His muscles locked up. He fell forward, his face hitting the damp tablecloth with a sickening thud. Martha didn't stop. She opened her hand and let the silver bloodstone ring fall. It bounced once and landed right in the center of the judge's puddle of water. The mud began to dissolve, revealing the bright cold silver and the deep red of the stone. The judge stared at it. He recognized it instantly. He had seen it 100 times on the hand of his old friend. He looked at the ring, then at the dying man on the table, then at Martha. "Where did you find this?" the judge asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. "Under the floorboards of the third stall," Martha said, "right where the body was dragged."